I was 3 months away from being called to the bar when my parents sat me down in the living room and told me they were pulling my articling support. Not because the money was gone. Not because of anything I had done at work. But because I had told the truth about my brother-in-law at Christmas dinner, and my sister had decided that was unforgivable. Let me back up. My name is Lee Calloway, and I am 31 years old. I had spent the last 3 years working as an articling student at a mid-sized firm in Ottawa, putting in 60-hour weeks, eating dinner at my desk more nights than not, surviving on coffee and the quiet conviction that the finish line was close enough to touch. My parents had been helping me cover rent during the articling year, because articling salaries in Ontario are not what people imagine when they think about becoming a lawyer, and because they had always said, since I was 17 years old, that they would support my education all the way through. That was the deal. That was the understanding scene. It had never been in writing because it had never needed to be. What it needed, apparently, was a different daughter. My sister's name is Paige. She is 4 years older than me, and she has always been the one my parents oriented themselves around, the way plants tilt toward light without even deciding to. Paige was the first to get married, the first to buy a house, the first to give them grandchildren, and every milestone she hit was treated like a civic event. I was not resentful of this, or at least I had spent many years convincing myself I wasn't. I loved my sister. I still do. In that complicated, bruised way you love someone who has hurt you so many times you've stopped being surprised by it. Her husband's name is Craig. Craig Hendricks. He worked in commercial real estate and had the particular energy of a man who had been told he was charming so many times that he had stopped needing it to be true. He was loud at family dinners. He talked over my mother. He had opinions about wine he couldn't pronounce correctly, and he delivered those opinions like verdicts. My parents adored him. My father golfed with him. My mother asked for his advice about their investments, which made my stomach turn in a way I couldn't always explain. The thing about Craig was that he was also, quietly and methodically, not a good person to work with. I knew this because my colleague Tam had told me. Tam worked at a different firm but moved in overlapping professional circles, and one evening over drinks near Spark Street she mentioned, almost as an aside, that a mutual contact had flagged Craig's company in connection with a disclosure problem on a commercial lease deal. She wasn't specific because she didn't need to be. I filed it away and didn't think much of it. Until Christmas. We were at my parents' house in Canada. My mother had made tourtière, which she only did at Christmas, and the table looked the way it always looked in December, full of mismatched candles, and the good dishes she kept in the cabinet the rest of the year. My nephew and niece were still young enough to be managed with tablet time in the den, and the adults had been sitting with wine long enough that the conversation had loosened into the kind of comfortable sprawl that happens when everyone has eaten too much, and no one wants to be the first to move. Craig was talking about a deal he was working on. Some commercial development near Barhaven. He was describing it the way he always described his work, in terms of scale and difficulty, and his own central role in navigating it, and at some point he turned to me and asked, with that particular smile he had, whether I found real estate law interesting or whether it was too slow for someone with my ambitions. I said something non-committal. I was tired and full and I didn't want to get into it. But then my father laughed and said, "Come on, Lee, Craig's being modest. He just closed the biggest deal of his career." And something in me, maybe it was the wine, maybe it was 3 years of accumulated exhaustion, maybe it was watching my father look at Craig with the same bright confidence he had never quite managed to aim at me, said the quiet part out loud. I said I'd heard the Barhaven development had run into some compliance issues, that there had been questions about the disclosure process on the lease agreements. I said I didn't know the details, only what I'd heard through the professional grapevine, and I wasn't making any accusations. The table went quiet in the specific way that tables go quiet when someone has said a true thing at the wrong time. Craig's smile didn't move. It just stopped reaching his eyes. He said that was an interesting thing to bring up at Christmas dinner, and that he hoped I wasn't going to make a habit of listening to gossip and passing it off as legal insight. My father nodded. My mother looked at her plate. Paige didn't say anything until we were in the kitchen, when she pulled me aside to refill the water pitcher and told me in a voice that was very quiet and very controlled that I had just embarrassed her husband in front of our parents, and that she expected an apology before the night was over. I said I hadn't embarrassed him. I'd mentioned something I'd heard. He was the one who'd made it into a scene. She said that was a very lawyerly way to avoid taking responsibility. I said that was a very convenient framing for someone who didn't want to hear the answer. She went back to the table, looking at the cookbooks lined up above the stove, the same ones that had been there since I was a child, and I felt something go still inside me. Not anger. Something older than anger, something that had been waiting. The new year arrived. I went back to work. I told myself the Christmas thing would blow over, the way things usually did in our family, slowly and without anyone directly acknowledging what had happened. It did not blow over. In the first week of January, my father called me on a Tuesday evening and told me they had decided to stop the rent support. He said he and my mother had talked about it, and they felt that at 31, I should be managing my own finances, and that the help had gone on long enough. He said this in his measured, reasonable voice, the one he used when he had rehearsed what he was going to say, and wanted it to sound like logic rather than punishment. I asked him if this had anything to do with Christmas. He said Christmas was a separate matter. I asked him whether Paige had spoken to him about it. He said the decision was his and my mother's. I said, all right, just like that. Not all right, I understand. Not all right, I'll figure it out. Just all right, flat and without give, the way you say it when a door has closed and you've heard the latch. He said he was glad I was being mature about it. I said goodbye and hung up. I sat in my apartment on the 6th floor of a building on Elgin Street, and I looked at the city lights coming in through the window, and I did the math in my head. Rent in Ottawa had not become more affordable in the years I had been in school. My articling salary covered my basics and left a margin that was exactly the width of my parents' contribution. Without it, I would need to move, or take on debt, or do both. I did not sleep well that night, but I also did not panic. I want to be clear about that because it matters to what came next. I had spent 3 years learning to work under pressure without showing it, and whatever my parents had intended that phone call to accomplish, panic was not what it produced. What it produced was a spreadsheet. By Thursday, I had mapped out 4 options: a smaller apartment in Centertown that would cut my rent by $300 a month, a line of credit through my bank, a conversation with the managing partner at my firm about a small advance on my post-call salary, and a short-term arrangement with my friend Ren, who had a spare room and had offered it to me the previous spring when she sensed things at home were getting tense. I texted Ren on Thursday night and asked if the offer still stood. She replied in 11 minutes. She said she'd move some boxes and have the room ready by the weekend. That Saturday, I packed 2 carloads of essentials, texted my building manager about breaking my lease early, and drove across the Queensway in February sleet. With my winter coats piled on the back seat and my laptop bag wedged next to the emergency kit I had kept in my trunk since I got my license at 16. I had learned to be prepared for my father, which is one of those ironies you notice, and then set aside because there is nothing useful to do with it. I did not tell my parents I was moving. I did not call Paige. I did not post anything or send anything or contact anyone at Craig's company or reach out to Tam or do any of the things a person in a story is supposed to do at the point when they've finally had enough. I just moved. I reorganized my life around what I actually had rather than what had been promised. On Monday, I went back to work. On Tuesday, I sat in on a file review meeting and contributed 3 observations that my supervising partner described afterward as sharp. On Wednesday, I ate lunch at my desk and researched the Ontario government's articling grant program, which I had known about in theory and had never applied for because I hadn't needed to. I applied on Thursday. I was approved for a partial amount within 2 weeks. It wasn't everything, but it was real and it was mine. My phone was not quiet during this time. My mother called on the Sunday after I moved, and I let it go to voicemail. My father called on Monday. I let that go too. On Wednesday, Paige texted me something that I read, and then put my phone face down on Ren's kitchen table and sat there for a moment just breathing. The text said, "What did you send, Craig?" 4 words, no punctuation, no context, no preamble. Just that, arriving at 7:42 in the morning from my sister who had spent 3 weeks acting as though she held the moral high ground without any possibility of contest. I stared at it for a long time. I had not sent Craig anything. I had not made any calls to anyone connected to his deal. I had not followed up with Tam, had not written any emails, had not contacted his company's counterparties, or their lawyers, or anyone on any regulatory body. I had packed 2 carloads of my belongings in February sleet and moved across the city, and gone back to work. Whatever Craig believed I had done, whatever had shaken him enough to make my sister send that message before 8 in the morning, was not something I had done. It was something he was afraid I might do, or something he was afraid I already knew. I put my phone in my coat pocket and walked to work. My father called again that afternoon. This time I picked up. He sounded different than he had on the Tuesday he'd cut the rent support. The measured quality was gone. He sounded like someone who had walked into a room expecting one thing and found another entirely, and was still standing in the doorway trying to make sense of it. He said, "Lee, what did you send? What did you send to anyone?" I told him the truth. I said I hadn't sent anything to anyone. I said I had moved out of my apartment, applied for an articling grant, taken Ren up on her spare room, and gone back to work. I said I was safe and I would be in touch when I was ready. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone listening, the quiet of someone recalculating. He said he needed to look into something and he would call me back. He hung up without saying goodbye. I sat in the conference room off the main hallway at work, the one that was usually empty in the late afternoon, and I looked at the framed print of the Peace Tower. Someone had hung there for reasons I had never understood, and I waited. Ren, who knew all of this, had sent me a single text that afternoon that said, "Soup, when you get home." No question mark, just soup. I loved her for that in a way I couldn't have articulated. My father called back 2 hours and 20 minutes later. He started to say my name and then stopped. In 31 years, I had never heard my father stop in the middle of a sentence. He was a man who completed his thoughts. Always. He said, "I need to tell you something about Craig." What had happened in the 48 hours since Paige had sent me that text was this. The compliance issue I had mentioned at Christmas, the one I had described as something I'd heard through the professional grapevine, had not stayed in the grapevine. Tam's contact had filed a formal complaint with RECO, the Real Estate Council of Ontario, about the disclosure problem on the Barhaven development. It was not the first complaint against Craig's brokerage. There was a pattern, documented, involving 3 separate transactions in which material information had been withheld from commercial tenants during lease negotiations. Craig had known. He had, according to the complaint, actively directed junior agents to omit the information. This was not gossip anymore. Craig had known about the RECO investigation for several weeks. He had not told Paige. He had not told my parents, who had been taking his financial advice, and who had, I later learned, referred 2 of their friends to his brokerage in the past year. He had told no one. What he had done instead was decide that the safest version of events was one in which I was the problem. In which my comment at Christmas dinner was not an honest, offhand thing I'd said because I was tired and full of tourtière and quietly watching my father admire a man I didn't trust. In which I had a vendetta, an agenda, some reason to want to damage him. He had built that version for my sister, and my sister, who had been loving Craig's version of reality for 8 years, had accepted it completely. My father told me all of this in a voice I had never heard from him before. Not broken, exactly, but something adjacent to broken. Hollowed out. He said Paige was upstairs. He said Craig had gone for a drive and hadn't come back yet. He said the house felt wrong, and he wasn't sure what to do with that. I didn't offer him comfort, not right away, because I was sitting in an empty conference room in a law office. I had been working 60 hours a week for 3 years. And I had just been told that my education support had been pulled, not because I needed to grow up financially, but because a man who had been defrauding tenants was better at constructing a sympathetic narrative than I was. I said I needed some time. He said, of course. I said I wasn't angry at him, which was mostly true. I was angry, but not only at him, and not in a way I could usefully direct at anyone in that moment. I said what happened at Christmas was not a mistake. I said that I had heard something true and I had repeated it honestly, and even if Craig had been completely innocent of everything, pulling my rent support over an awkward dinner comment would have been wrong. The fact that he wasn't innocent made it worse, but the principle had been the same from the beginning. You don't hold someone's future hostage because they said something you didn't want to hear. My father was quiet for a long time, then he said, "I know." That was all. 2 words. From a man who had spent 31 years giving me explanations and caveats and reasoned positions. Just, "I know." I said goodbye. I went home to Ren's apartment. She had made the soup. It was a lentil soup with a lot of cumin and a piece of crusty bread on the side, and we ate it at her kitchen table without talking about any of it, and I was grateful for that more than I could say. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. They were the opposite of dramatic. They were the ordinary, grinding, unglamorous work of a life that has been rerouted and is finding its way back to where it was supposed to go. The articling grant covered 60% of what I had lost in rent support. The other 40% I managed by picking up 2 additional evening files my firm had been looking to staff, which my supervising partner was happy to assign me because, as she put it, I was one of the more reliable people on the floor, and reliability is not as common as people imagine. I worked hard. I studied for my licensing exams on Ren's couch with a blanket and a second cup of tea, and the focused, quiet stubbornness of someone who has decided that nothing at a dinner table is going to be the end of her story. My mother called me 6 weeks after the conversation with my father. Not to explain what had happened, not to reconstruct the timeline or tell me what she had or hadn't known. She called to say that she missed me. That the house felt different without my visits on Sundays, that she had been making tortilla wrong her whole life, and had only just discovered it because she'd tried a different recipe and realized the original one she used was missing a step. I laughed at that. I hadn't expected to. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't known about the RECO complaints, which I believed, and she said she should have asked more questions before going along with the decision about the rent support, which I also believed, and which cost her something to say out loud, and I held on to that. I said I needed more time before I was ready to be back at Sunday dinners. She said she understood. I also told her, gently but clearly, that the kind of support that can be withdrawn over a dinner disagreement is not support in any meaningful sense, that I had understood this in principle for a long time, but that I understood it in my body now, in a way that would change how I operated going forward. I said this not as an accusation but as information. Something she needed to know about where I stood. She said she heard me. My father sent me a card in the mail. An actual card, the kind with a nature photograph on the front, a loon on a lake in soft morning light. Inside he had written 3 sentences in his handwriting, which is small and deliberate and very like him. He said he had been wrong to make my financial stability conditional on my behavior in a family dispute. He said he was proud of how I had handled everything, and that proud was not a big enough word, but it was the one he had. He said he loved me. I kept the card in the drawer of my desk at Ren's apartment. Craig and Paige, I learned through my mother, were in a difficult place. The RECO investigation had become more serious. There were conversations between them I was not privy to and did not need to be. Paige and I had not spoken since Christmas, and I had stopped trying to predict what that silence would eventually become. Some silences close, some don't. I had decided to let that one take whatever shape it needed without my interference. What I know is that I wrote my licensing exams in April, and I passed. Both of them. My supervising partner shook my hand in the hallway outside the meeting room, where she'd told me the results, and her handshake is the kind that means something because she doesn't offer it casually. 2 of my colleagues from the firm took me out for a beer at a pub on Bank Street, and we sat in a booth in the back and talked about everything except law for 2 hours, and it was exactly what I needed. I have an apartment now. My own. On the 2nd floor of a building in the glebe with big windows and radiator heat that clanks in November, and a tiny balcony I have put 1 chair on because 1 chair is all that fits. I make my own tortilla at Christmas. I am still working on the recipe. The thing I carried out of my parents' house, the last time I was there before everything shifted, was a folder I kept in my old room. It had my undergraduate transcripts, my LSAT scores, my law school acceptance letter, and a note from a professor who had written a recommendation for me years earlier and had included a line I had never forgotten. She had said that I had the kind of clarity that most people spend their whole careers trying to develop. That folder sits on the shelf above my desk in the glebe apartment. Not as proof of anything, not as a trophy. Just as a reminder that I had been seen accurately by someone paying attention. That I had been headed somewhere for a long time before anyone tried to redirect me, and that the direction was mine, not theirs. No one can pull funding from that. If you've ever been the person at the table who was asked to stay quiet to protect someone else's carefully arranged story, you already know why it matters when someone finally doesn't. Subscribe and hit the bell. I'm not done talking.